To the right, the King of the Palatinate, for example. We also have Brandenburg, and also here, for example, Bohemia. And Bohemia is especially important next to Saxony, who is here as well, because it was the territory of Prague and the region around it where the 30 Years' War starts. About the question who is going to rule there, but rulership in Bohemia was not about becoming king there only, it was also about this very powerful position in the political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, and that is one of the reasons why this was so contested and why this would take such a long time for the conflict to be solved in the long run. By the way, the emperor that we are mostly dealing with in this period of the 30 Years' War is Ferdinand II, of the Habsburgs, because more than 18 years of the 30 years of a war he was in charge, and like I said, based in Vienna, so the Catholic homeland of the emperor. That is the region where he is coming from. He had rather limited military power. That's also quite important in that political system of the Holy Roman Empire. So he was depending a lot on the imperial states to support him with troops. That was a two-sided dependency at this time. So the situation was not very stable religiously, politically at this point, but of course there were other factors as well in the European world at the beginning of the 17th century that made the situation rather tricky. One of them was the fact that a lot of people were believing in those years that the apocalypse would probably happen rather soon. During their lifetime already, they were interpreting signs in this period, like, for example, in 1618, the fact that a number of comets were seen on the night sky in Europe for a couple of weeks, actually. So this is one that obviously appeared like that close to Heidelberg in 1618. That was exactly the year when the war broke out, and many people were interpreting these signs as signs of future mishappenings to come, so of the plague, of war, of hunger, and so on. Another outside factor that was quite important in those times was the climate. We are talking a lot about the climate today, but already in the 16th century, people were experiencing changes to what they had seen before, and that was the so-called Little Ice Age, which lasted roughly from 1560 to the second half of the 17th century. Much colder temperatures than people were used to. Often in May, which is the start of summer, here in this area, snow was coming back again, for example. Many winter pictures were painted in those years, and you can imagine that, of course, the harvests were often rather bad under these circumstances. 2 degrees Celsius less was the average temperature than in the most other years before. And that was especially very difficult because the population in Europe had been increasing a lot. Between 1500 and the start of the 30 Years' War, it had almost doubled, and of course therefore people were depending a lot on good harvests, and that was not really the case in that period of time. So we have a variety of factors that make people's lives difficult at this time, and especially, of course, the religious confrontation seems to make war more and more likely. And finally, it starts in Bohemia, that is the region around Prague. And Prague is dominated by a Protestant nobility for a long time. But when the king passes away, the emperor tries to insist that his own family will take over the responsibilities of becoming king in Bohemia again. Of course, it was all about this position of the prince elector in the system of the Holy Roman Empire. So a Habsburg becomes king in Bohemia, and that happens mostly against the will of the ruling family. Still, they accept it for a certain while, but then the Habsburgs start to cut down on all the liberties that the Protestants had achieved in the decades before. That means a lot of Catholic restoration was carried out in a short amount of time, and that was something that the Protestant nobility in Prague did not want to accept. So they start a rebellion against the emperor, who is now the leader of Bohemia as well. And they started in May 1618 with a very symbolic act, and that is the so-called defenestration, which has a tradition in the history of Bohemia already. It is derived from Latin, and it means simply throwing somebody out of the window. And that is what happens. In May 1618, 3 delegates of the emperor and of the Catholic side in this conflict are thrown out of the window in the castle in Prague. It's much higher in reality than it seems here on this picture, so roughly 17 meters or almost 50 feet it goes down here. But obviously, there was a lot of rubbish here at the bottom, so all the 3 people that were thrown out of the window did survive in the end. They went to Vienna, complained about that very open act of rebellion. For the time being, however, the Protestants were in charge of Prague and Bohemia again, and they tried to call a new king to Bohemia, and they found somebody in the very western part of the Holy Roman Empire, and that was the king of the Palatinate. That means Frederick V, who was residing in Heidelberg, rather powerful leader, especially because he was married to the daughter of the King of England, and the two decided, yes, he should take over the crown of Bohemia as well. They traveled to Prague together in 1619. But of course the Habsburgs didn't want to accept that situation in the long run, so they prepared for war, and only 1 year later a major battle occurred between the two sides, the so-called Battle of the White Mountain. This is Frederick V, by the way, who came from Heidelberg to Prague. The Battle of the White Mountain led very close to Prague in those times, and you had roughly 28,000 Catholic troops for the emperor, mostly provided by the Duke of Bavaria, and about 20,000 Protestant defenders of Bohemia and of Prague. And the better supplies were with the Catholic side, which meant they won the upper hand after a couple of hours. You can see what this battle was looking like in detail. So these very large pikes here with the infantry was a very common weapon, but you also had, of course, the cavalry as well. But in the end, the battle was decided rather soon in favor of the Catholic side, and Frederick V, the new king, had to escape. He went into exile to the Netherlands, and his rule had been only very short, something that the many pamphlets at this time, the equivalents to the modern newspapers, made fun of. You can see one here. So this shows Frederick V's and the Wheel of Fortune. He comes from Heidelberg, he climbs on the throne in Prague, he rules for a short while, and then he falls down already again and has to be pulled out of the water. From that time on, that's also part of this pamphlet, people call him the Winter King, because he basically ruled only for 1 season. Yeah, but of course the Habsburgs take bloody revenge. That is very typical for the time that we are looking at. No less than 30,000 people have to emigrate from Bohemia, so the entire Protestant elite basically, and many ordinary people as well. And the leaders of the rebellion against the Habsburgs are killed, and their heads are put on spikes. You can see that here, and on a tower at one of the bridges in the middle of Prague, and they remain there for no less than 10 years. So that shows you this cruelty of the time. This very symbolic punishment is another sign of the period that we are dealing with. Yeah, so that was basically a victory for the Catholic side, and the conflict might have been over at that point already, but it wasn't. One of the reasons was that the emperor had promised to the Duke of Bavaria a reward. He should take over the land of the Winter King, including the Palatinate on the Rhine, and also his position in the Prince Elector's college. So the Bavarian troops were now moving to Heidelberg to put it under siege. And we can now see that the Protestants are still trying to react, but they never manage really to stand together in a strong way. Rather, we see various stages of international interference on the Protestant side, but one after the other. And that's one of the reasons why this conflict drags on for such a long time. So we basically have at least 4 different stages, 4 different periods that follow each other and that form the 30 Years' War in the long run. So you can see the first one is the Bohemian Rebellion that I just mentioned, and the Palatinate War in Heidelberg, that's only 5 years. Then Denmark will basically join the Protestant side, of course hoping to win more influence and territory in the northern part of the German-speaking mainland. The Swedish War is a very important period because Gustavus Adolphus,